So, hello everybody, I'm Ellie from the Charles Causley Festival, and you are currently joining us a Q&A with Kate Werran about her latest book. We're going to share a short 13-minute video which we had as part of the Charles Causley Festival this year, and then after that we're going to then launch into some questions. So I'm going to share my screen with you all now and play the short video, and if for whatever reason you can't hear it or can't see it, or if it doesn't work, because I don't get to know that because I obviously can't see what you see, feel free to just unmute yourself and obviously let me know. So I shall do that now. We have just had one lady just join us. I'm going to wait until she's joined and her audio is on, because then we can make sure she's muted. Otherwise, obviously, that's going to interrupt everybody. So brilliant. Madeline, you're fantastic. You just joined us and you muted straight away, so well done. You're just in time. We're about to launch into seeing the video of Kate's talk from the Causley Festival. So let me...
Hello, and a very warm welcome to Kate Werran's new book, An American Uprising in World War II. My name's David Werran, and I'm Kate's dad, and I just have a walk-on part in this saga. But I do have an interesting connection to Charles Causley, our Cornish poet, and the best poet laureate we ever had. In 1947, my family moved back to the West Country, and as an 8-year-old boy, I soon became aware of the impact the American soldiers had on wartime Launceston. It was the talk of the town. Stories of the plentiful food supplies, of course, the American cars and the jeeps, and the stunts they got up to, how they would compete in climbing the Castle Mountain, often involving injuries. How they would go out to the outskirts of the town to the local snake quarry, tossing in cans of ham, and then waiting for the unsuspecting rats to emerge, who would then be machine gunned. And then, of course, the shootout in Launceston Town Square by the White Hart Hotel. An event which one Launcestonian said was the biggest thing to happen since the days of the smugglers. In 1948 and 1949, I was fortunate to be a pupil of Charles Causley at the National School, during which time my mother died and he took me under his wing and we became friends ever since. In 1951, shortly after he published his first and only book of short stories, Hannes the Dance, we had a chance meeting in the square and we talked about his book and talked about the stories that could be told about Launceston. We were standing outside Lloyd's Bank, and he pointed to Hicks the haberdasher's next door, which had a bullet hole still in the window, remnant of that fateful day in 1943. And he said, that's a story to be told. And he went on to say about the horrors of segregation and what a stain it was on the United States during that time. In later years, when I was in the civil service, I would bring my family down for our annual holiday to Cornwall, and we would call into Launceston to see family and friends and to see Charles if he was around. Here's a picture that I took of Charles in the early 1980s, showing Kate and her young brother, Jonathan. And then when I retired at the end of the 1990s, we would have lunch every month until his sad demise in 2003. But we would often touch upon this subject of that mutiny in Launceston. And so it was really, Charles was the genesis of that story, which that chance meeting we had in the square in 1951, which inspired the interest of Kate when she came down to Launceston, and she was determined to write a book about it, to find out the true facts. And here she is to tell you all about it.
Hello, my name's Kate, and I'm here to tell you about my book. It's called An American Uprising in Second World War England, Mutiny in the Duchy. Let me start by setting the scene. It's a cool September evening in 1943, and the streets are still damp from rain earlier that day. Just after 9 o'clock, a large group of soldiers are seen making their way back to camp, and when they get there, they arm themselves with Tommy guns, ammunition, and bayonets. And then they put themselves into formation and marched back into town 3 abreast. And the sound of those army-issue boots hitting the street is something witnesses remember to this day. They say it was as if an entire company of men was moving through the night. Now, this band of brothers was undoubtedly ready for the fight of its life. It's just it didn't have the official enemy in its sight, because unbelievably, this wasn't happening in mainland Europe, Nazi-occupied Europe, but on the British home front, specifically the Norman town of Launceston in Cornwall. So when the soldiers reach the town's war memorial, they stop, because there they find a group of soldiers milling around 2 US Army jeeps. A few words are uttered, and that's all it takes to trigger a dramatic all-American gunfight that leaves bodies, vehicles, and shops broken, but not destroyed. The story captivated the nation. There was a sensational court-martial that followed, and this was headline news in Britain and America. It triggered alarm bells in Whitehall and Washington, and prompted attempts to cover this story up. Clearly, there was more to this mutiny than meets the eye, and the clue here is in the fact that this involved a group of African-American soldiers firing on the white soldiers who policed them. Take a look at this picture. At first sight, it's just troops enjoying the show. But look again and you see that rigid line of racial separation that characterised the US Army. My research has shown that the Launceston Mutiny is a microcosm of the racism in the US Army, the sympathy that this provoked amongst ordinary British people, and the huge strain this in itself put on the special relationship. So my book is about the mutiny, it's about the men, and it's about the compelling sequence of events that drove them to mutiny in Launceston, 1943. And I'm going to start by dwelling on that compelling countdown, because I think it might just surprise you. So the story of the Launceston Mutiny really starts with the US Army that came over to Britain to trial and train for D-Day. Because the army was segregated, it was split along racial lines, mimicking the Jim Crow separation of society in the American South. That meant there was different transport, different schools. If you bear with me, I've got a couple of photos I'd like to share. It meant different restaurants. I don't know if you can see that top picture there. They catered to white trade only, even different drinking fountains. Eventually, 1 in 10 of the US Army was African American. And there were 2 things they found very quickly on joining up. Firstly, they'd be fighting war from the decidedly unglamorous supply side of things, which basically meant they joined up and they're given roles in transport, engineering, or the quartermaster corps. And the second thing they found out that their training was universally oppressive, racist, and all too often violent. And we know that was certainly the case with the Launceston mutineers, because we know that from Walter White. He was the head of the NAACP and came himself to England to investigate. And he heard the very sad stories of these Launceston mutineers and the way that they'd been treated in all their training camps to date. So that was the US Army, and eventually 130,000 African Americans came to this country to train and before D-Day. So that was the story with the US military. What was the story in the wider US society? Well, in fact, that summer of 1943 was called the Long Hot Bloody Summer because racial tensions spilt over in 5 US cities. The Second World War heightened inequality over jobs, over housing, even over who got the plaudits for fighting. But things kicked off in LA and then they accelerated in Detroit. And if you bear with me, I'll just show you another very powerful picture. As you can see, this poor guy here is being chased by a white mob. In Detroit, 34 people died, 25 of whom were black. So this was the situation in US society, and it is inevitable that the racial tension that was here, that was already in the military, came over in the waves of US servicemen who were crossing the Atlantic to come to Britain to trial and train for D-Day. So this was the imported racism, racial tension that was coming from America. And what was the situation in Britain? Well, surprisingly, despite ruling an empire upon which the sun never set, there were very few people of colour in Britain during the Second World War. The British black population was meant to be about 15,000, and they're based around the port cities of London, Cardiff and Liverpool. Undoubtedly, in such a monocultural society, racism prevailed. There were race riots in 1919, and one of the heroes of my story, the cricketer Leary Constantine, who came from the West Indies to Britain in the 20s to play cricket, said that personal slights were an unpleasant part of life in Britain for anyone of my colour. So this was Britain. How did it react to America when it came and brought its racial tension to British villages and greens? The answer is surprising and intriguing. And the evidence comes from secret government bodies that were monitoring reaction to the colour bar. It comes from censored letters. It comes from polls. It comes from editorials in newspapers and letters to the newspapers and to Foreign Office departments and to the Home Office. The universal reaction from Britain seems to have been a general rejection of the egregious racism that people saw played out in Britain. And that was something quite surprising. And it came from, I'll give you a few examples here, the brilliant George Orwell, who said, the general consensus of opinion seems to be that the only American soldiers with decent manners are the Negroes. Mass Observation was a nascent polling organisation. And then one of their reports in 1943, it concluded that feelings about Americans can be fairly sharply divided into feelings about white and coloured troops. As a general rule, the latter have made themselves more liked in this country. It was there in Blackpool, a factory worker reported how, I've personally seen the American troops literally kick, and I mean kick, the coloured soldiers off the pavement. To Essex, when a particularly disgusted father protested that a dance he'd taken his family to was cancelled when a black soldier dared to ask a white woman to dance. So this put massive pressure on the special relationship, and the violence and the tension that was in America that summer started to come over to Britain. And the most extreme example of violence was an armed confrontation in Bamber Bridge in Lancashire. It left one person dead and many injured. It kicked off when African American soldiers were very overzealously policed by the white MPs. And the pub where it all kicked off, the locals drinking there, the British servicemen who were also drinking there, they laid the blame very squarely at the foot of the white MPs, and their sympathies lay with the black American soldiers. 200 miles away, just to give you a breadth of where it was happening, and a few days later in Corsham, Wiltshire, there was another mass violent demonstration on the streets. And if you bear with me, the head of Southern Command, Sir Harry Haig, reported that a large group of civilians gathered. They were heard saying, they don't like the blacks, why don't they leave them alone? They're as good as they are. That's democracy. The situation eventually developed into one of mass insubordination by the coloured troops, and at one point a coloured sergeant who'd been ordered to bring his company commander replied, "We ain't no slaves, this is England." So the clash in Launceston is a perfect microcosm, a perfect reflection of the tension within the US Army and the tension in its outward-facing relations with the British. And things didn't get better after Launceston. Listen to this. It's a month before D-Day, and it's a US Army morale report. The whites disliked the Negroes, and the Negroes disliked the whites. It was tersely reported. The predominant note is, if that invasion doesn't occur soon, trouble will. Clearly, the colour bar was a wedge in Anglo-American relations, and it was something that the authorities needed to kind of cover up. So by a quirk of fate, the Launceston mutineers arrived in Cornwall, and this was slap bang in the heart of GI country. The 29th Infantry moved to Devon and Cornwall, and it is impossible to exaggerate the amount of luxury, fun, and glamour that came with these American arrivals. It meant oranges, chocolate, cigarettes, nylons, jazz, all served up by voices straight from the movies. But underneath this shiny, confident veneer, there throbbed this racial tension that never really was far from the surface. And by quirk of fate, the Launceston mutineers arrived after two British incidents that really polarised the British feeling about race. And it started with that most quintessentially British sport, cricket. Liri Constantine, who I mentioned before, was down in London that summer to play a charity game to raise funds for the troops, actually. And when he got to his London hotel, he was ejected because there were complaints from American servicemen staying there. Hot on its heels came the case of Emilia King, a young Black British woman whose application to join the Women's Land Army was rejected on the basis of her ethnicity. Now, she coolly took this to MP, and there was an almighty row in Parliament, in the newspapers, where race was being talked about, and it kind of culminated in a volcanic poll on the streets of London. It was conducted by mass observation, and it found that 75% of people found a very definite disapproval of the colour bar. So it was into this mix that the Launceston mutineers arrived. And when they got to Launceston, on their very first day, hours after climbing the hill to their base, they had their roll call. And at their roll call, they were told that they would be restricted to camp. So that meant that after hours, when they'd finished their work for the day, they wouldn't be allowed into the town. This was the third camp that these soldiers had arrived at. It was the third camp they were restricted to, and something snapped. And the story that followed of the mutiny was something that was a national talking point. The authorities wanted to cover this story up. They wanted it to go away. Why? Because it spoke volumes about the racial tension we've discussed within the army, the sympathy that the British people had for the African Americans, and everything this meant about a fighting force that was meant to be taking back Europe in a matter of months. So they tried on 2 occasions to censor the story. Firstly, at the outset, the trial judge said that there would be a ban on the reporting of race. Now, this attempt was foiled by a plucky Daily Mirror journalist who piped up that this fact was already in the public domain, thanks to their paper, actually. So this was something that could be reported on, and this was a breakthrough for the American journalists because it had been censored before, and this could now get out in America. But ultimately, the American authorities won because they censored at the very end of the trial. After 10 hours on the third day, they deliberated. And then to an expectant court, the trial judge came back again and he said, well, we've reached our verdict, but that verdict isn't going to be public. So it meant that after all this time, nobody knew what really happened. They didn't know whether the soldiers were innocent or guilty. None the least, the soldiers themselves, as they walked out of Paignton Police Court for that last time, they didn't know if they were guilty or innocent. It's extraordinary. So this is the story they tried to cover up, but you won't be surprised to know that the soldiers were found guilty. They weren't executed, as many in Launceston have long suspected, but they were given very long sentences of hard labour between 15 and 20 years. They were very young family men, these soldiers, so it was a very severe punishment. The American authorities, as I said, wanted to cover this up, but people were alive to it, from George Orwell to Churchill himself, because it caused him grave anxiety. So after many months, actually years of research, I've managed to piece back the story. And I think it's about time that this lost and now found story, which speaks such a lot about Britain and America at a certain point in our history, is time to be told. So I really hope that you have enjoyed this, and I hope that you might one day pick up my book. And in just a minute, I'll be reading a brief extract from the story to give you a flavour of my book. Thank you for listening.
Hello, everybody. So I'm back. There we go. That was obviously what was played during the digital festival. So for some of you, you may have actually already heard it. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to go through. So I haven't got anyone at the moment that's listed any questions on chat. If you have some questions that you'd like to pose to Kate, perhaps you've read the book, perhaps you're interested in reading the book, maybe you've got a favourite character, maybe there was something surprising that you didn't think was actually going to kind of spring out, then by all means pop that down in the chat and then I will read that out. But in the meantime, Kate, was there anything that you perhaps wanted to say? Oh, you're still on mute.
How's that? Is that better?
Yeah, we can hear you now.
I wanted to say thank you to you and to the festival for giving me this moment, this time to connect with readers. It's been brilliant, and I've had such a strong sort of response to the festival. I've had amazing stories told to me by people whose parents remember this story. There's a guy from Devon whose mum happened to be a bus conductress on a Plymouth route, and she, this young 21-year-old girl, physically ejected a white officer, American officer, who was trying to get the black soldiers on the bus to give up their seat for him. I've heard from a great guy near Penzance who tells a story where there was a pitched battle between white and black Americans on, and there was nothing else to use, so they used farming implements. So all these farming implements were used, they all got lost. He had to retrieve them. He was given the job of retrieving them, but he had to sign the Official Secrets Act, which I thought was quite telling, because I think there was this general need to cover things up from the authorities. And so what's been wonderful, is what I'm trying to say, is we've had lots of good feedback, an interesting story that kind of rams home my thesis and my ideas about why this story is so special and why it's so important, especially given the events in the summer in America, why we really need to remember what happened then, and maybe we can learn a lesson or two.
Absolutely. We've got a couple of questions that are coming through. We've got a comment first of all from Karen. I have photos of bullet holes around the stone doorway entrance to the White Hart Hotel. Fantastic. That's amazing. Madeline, you've got a question. Would you like to unmute yourself and read it out?
Hi.
Hi, Madeline.
What was the research process like when you were writing the book? And also, were you able to talk to anyone who was there or aware of what was happening at the time?
That's a great question. The research process, it started very early when I was quite young, with being told about it by my dad. And we used to go, as Dad said in his introduction, we used to come down to Launceston to see my Auntie Marjorie. And there's lots of family around. So it's part of our growing up, actually, part of our childhood. The research started, I took a gap year with my husband. We're both freelance, and we travelled around America in 2005, and we travelled to the South, and I didn't really know much about America. I didn't know much about its history, but the two things kind of came together, this story that I was intrigued by back home and the American history. And so I came back and I thought, I'm going to find out about this. And I spoke to a great historian over here called Graham Smith, and he wrote a brilliant book in the 1980s called When Jim Crow Met John Bull. And it was part of a university thesis, and he'd done a lot of research on these clashes that were happening throughout Britain during the time that the Americans were here and training for D-Day. So he said, I think you should try and get a copy of the court-martial manuscript, and it was a brilliant suggestion. So I put in a Freedom of Information request to get the court-martial manuscript, and it took ages. There were loads of possibilities of what it could be, because all I really knew is that it happened in Launceston, and I think I had a newspaper report, but it wasn't great on giving loads of detail. So we tracked it down, and I spent a lot of time sort of hassling them. But by the time it arrived, I was 39 weeks pregnant with my first baby. And so it arrived, I put it under the bed, and I brought it out again when my youngest child started primary school. And then I started the research properly. I was lucky enough to speak to Joan Rendell, very famous Launceston resident who's written lots of books. She was there, she witnessed the event, and she was a fantastic storyteller. She had a brilliant memory for this. And so she brought the story alive, she brought the history alive, she brought Launceston alive, actually. She told me she was in love with, an American actor, Tyrone Power, was in love with her. You know, she had this very glamorous, racy sort of story, and then this amazing story about Launceston. My research, so I spoke to her about it before her death. This was early 2000s. And then I came back to the story fresh. I spoke to Arthur Wills on my Auntie Phil's recommendation. They've got a great museum in Launceston. I talked to them. And then I managed to track down some GIs who were serving in Launceston, were based in Launceston, again, before they died. So I had letters, I had conversations with them. And then I hit the archives, and that was amazing. For me, that was the most exciting bit, actually, because it was really nice just holding bits of paper that Churchill had signed, you know, the thing that this had caused him, grave anxiety. It's like an amazing moment. Mass observation through the British Library. So it was kind of like finding the real people, getting those amazing memories. And interestingly, actually, again, feedback from my talk earlier in the summer, a guy came back and his aunt remembers watching the fight, watching the shootout from an upper window, which I've recorded actually. So that's all going to be useful for more research for whenever I write again about it or whenever anyone talks about it. So the research process has involved secondary material, reading material, just general material, primary sources, and also the great people of Launceston as well. So that's how I approached my research, and it's every part of it has been amazing and surprising as well.
That's amazing. Madeline, have you got any follow-up question to that?
No, that was really interesting. Thank you.
Thank you, Madeline.
Fantastic question, absolutely. And I can see already, so Sarah Jane, are any of the soldiers still alive? And if so, were you able to trace them and talk to them? So you've spoken about that briefly. And Pauline, very similar question. What did you find out about those who survived? Are any still alive? And how difficult was it for you to follow them up?
It was for both of those questions. You know, the $1 million question for me was what happened to these men afterwards, and I could trace what happened to them through the big fat file that came from the judge advocate's office. So they all obviously went to prison. Their sentences were shortened after the war. I think they mostly got out in the late 1940s. There were 2 people who ended up in the prison service again. It was really difficult to trace them. It was my lasting regret is that I couldn't find relatives of these men. They will all be very, very old men now, you know, 100 plus, if they were around today. The big problem really was that the Second World War, during the Second World War and before, there'd been something called the Great Migration. So a large portion of people were moving from the south because there was no need for cotton picking so much now. That was now a mechanized process. And then the Second World War, because people could now work in the factories, that was now, you know, open to everyone. People were migrating to the north. So a lot of the boys in Launceston were from the south. I don't think they returned to the south, and it's very difficult to trace them. But I'm really hopeful, actually, that I might find relatives, that they might find me through the book, because I'd love them to know what happened, you know, what really happened in Launceston, and them to know that their story has been told for the first time. I think it's very important that they know that I don't think they did a bad thing. You know, I think it would have been very shameful for these guys going home, imprisoned, you know, taken out of the army with dishonor. I think it would be nice for them to know that maybe they were doing it for a reason, and that reason's so important.
And absolutely, I mean, it would be wonderful if relatives stumbled on it and then recognised the story and then felt an element of kind of validation, you know, in a positive kind of way. So Pauline and Jenny, it's Pauline and Sarah Jane, did that kind of help? Is there any follow-up question you've got?
No, I think that's fine, thank you. Whereabouts were they in the United States when you found them, Kate?
What do you mean?
State-wise?
State-wise, they were all from all different parts of the Met. Some were from, 3 of them were from Chicago. One of them was from New York, Missouri, Kansas. They were from all over, and they kind of came together to Oklahoma, where they joined their ordnance company, and that's where they were trained. But they were from all over America.
That's
And I think
interesting.
that's why the I think that's why everything sort of kicked off, because those who were from the north weren't really used to this treatment. And then they suddenly crossed, there's a very sad description from one of the soldiers, you know, they suddenly crossed the state line and got into Washington, and then it was all segregated carriages and, you know, not being treated very nicely. It was quite tangible.
Fantastic, thank you. Jenny, Jenny said, Kate, you mentioned you in the recording that you were going to read from your book. Will that happen this evening? Jenny, if you go over to the Charles Causley Trust's YouTube video, you can see the whole playing of it, and there's at least as much again, I think, or maybe a bit more. There's probably about 20 minutes, I think, of Kate reading from the book, so you'll be able to see the full.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'll do that later. Thank you.
You're welcome. Okay, so Nick, Nick Werran, is that actually David, or is that Nick? Because I know that David.
It's another Werran. That's
another. Oh, that's another.
We're multiplying. Yeah.
Oh, yes. Are you related?
Yes.
Oh, that's what I was going to say. Otherwise, what a coincidence! There's another one.
I would put my video on, but my wife's got flu-like symptoms. So I'm not going to expose her to the camera right now.
I hope she gets better soon. Nick, do you want to ask your question?
I would, if my sister will answer it. I had my original question has pretty much already been answered because it's very similar. I've actually got another question. It'd clearly make a great film, this, because of everything. The American audiences, I think, would be very interested in this. You can imagine it on Netflix. Do you think there's a possibility of it actually being made into an actual Hollywood type film because of all of the various boxes it ticks?
Well, do you know, it's had a lot of interest actually. So my background, I came to journalism. I trained as a journalist, and I worked for many years in TV documentaries. I used to make history documentaries, and it's from those sort of production companies there's been quite a lot of interest, and I'm really hoping to sign a contract next week to someone who's going to option the book for TV documentary and TV drama, and there has been interest from film companies, from 2 film companies as well. It's just all, you know, basically from that world, I know everything is very sort of up in the air and nothing's going to happen until it's signed, but it certainly attracted a lot of interest. And if and when I do sign something, Ellie, you're going to be actually probably the first to know, because it is such a big story for Launceston. And what I have been saying actually to the production companies, to everyone, what I'm really passionate about is that the film or whatever's made is filmed in Launceston, and that it uses as much local talent as we can, and that it's truthful to the story, because as somebody who likes documentaries, I love history documentaries, I love historical films, I like them when they're true. It's really nice when they're actually accurate, and I've said it's really important to me. I've spent the time getting these documents together and doing it justice, I feel. And so we don't have to make up cheesy sort of dialogue when it's all there. The court martial, I can't tell you open the court martial transcript that was written down at the time, and it is like opening a drama script. It is all there, even with the stage direction, you know, when the lawyer realizes that the people who are interrogating these soldiers didn't recognize them, they couldn't identify them. It's all there, you know, you don't have to make anything up. It's there, you know, in the flesh. So so they're the things that are really important to me. So fingers crossed, we'll have some news, hopefully before Christmas.
That would be very exciting, very exciting. Nick, did you want to perhaps follow that up at all, or is that all right?
It's a really good way of getting answers out of my family. I know. So, final follow-on question: Do you envisage? Do you have an idea of who you would ideally like to play the roles? If there was to be a film, like say the secretary in the court, or the lead incarcerated members from the GIs. Do you have Do you have an ideal
No,
cast?
I hadn't. Do you know what? I really don't know, Nick. I'd love your thoughts. I know you'll have some good thoughts. The one thing I would say is my heroine actually is the brilliant court reporter, this young, formidable woman who, well, I say woman, she was 21 years old. She was one of 6 women in the whole nation to work for the US Army as a court reporter. She was down as one of the best secretaries in the country, and it's rumoured that she worked on the Nuremberg trials. So I would like someone fantastic to play her, because I think her role is critical, actually, just in the reporting and just her view on this thing playing out. But Nick, who would you think of?
I'd probably go for what's the name, Atwell, for the secretary.
Okay.
Haley Atwell.
Yes, yeah. But what about the guys?
The ones which spring to mind are either dead or too old. So I'd have to
That's
think
my
about.
thought, because it would obviously be Idris Elba, but they were young guys. These were young.
You'd probably
men.
go for Chadwick Boseman, who's just sadly departed. Yeah.
Oh, brilliant! That's good. That's another chat for later, I think.
Yeah. Okay, so we've got some more questions. We actually got quite a few more questions, actually. Alan, would you like to pose your question?
Sorry, yeah, I just muted it. It's actually Cynthia, because there's the wrong label.
Hello, Cynthia.
Yeah, hello, Kate. One thing that I was wondering, actually, is the current attitude of the US military today when you tried to do your research over there and through them. I know you did have one officer helping you with the court-martial papers, but did you feel that they were interested, reluctant to talk about it? Did they want to keep it covered up? Did they even want to follow it up with you to see how it got on? That was it, really.
No, that's a brilliant question, actually. So the freedom of information, because I made a freedom of information request, they had to give me they had to give me the transcript. Researching around some of the military bases, so I got very kindly some photographs from some of the forts, and just the attitude there wasn't particularly progressive, I don't think. I don't feel their attitudes had changed towards race, and they were, so yeah, it wasn't actually, I actually felt that's why it's a really good question. Some of the times I was quite shocked by the attitude towards my subject matter. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you.
And I think actually the next question follows on quite nicely. Is it Catriona? Have I said that correctly?
Hello, sorry, it's Catriona, but it's actually Jasper, my husband, who's asking the question.
Jasper, fire away.
Yeah, hi Kate. One of the things I found particularly interesting in the book is actually how it cast a light on broader kind of US-UK relations while the US Army was preparing for D-Day. I mean, I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. Because often it's the relationship is portrayed as very rosy, and I think some of your books suggested actually there were much broader tensions as well in the relationship.
Now that's again a great question. For me, I'm 48, born in 1972, brought up, and I felt very much that everyone's grandparents had been involved in some way in the war, and the picture of war that was portrayed in all the dramas we used to watch on TV, it was all this united front, and we were all in it together. And that was the thing that really shocked me during my research for this, reading mass observation, reading the newspapers of rape, sexual assault, murder, and they were all covered up. And somebody, I think it might have been Orwell, actually called it an occupying army, what it was like. And we feel just because we speak the same language, we are the same. And there was a huge cultural difference. There was this brilliant introduction to Americans for life in Britain, and it was very their views on us and our views perhaps on them as well, we were sort of caricatured, and they came with their assumptions. They felt that because people spoke correctly. They felt wherever they went, people were speaking English properly, and so they were snobby, and it would antagonize people. Whenever the soldiers seemed to get together, they were paid 3 times what a British soldier was paid. There was always friction, there was always tension. And so, as you say, I, as a woman as well, reading some of the comments they used to make about British women and how they treated and felt that we should be treated here, it's just really rude. And yeah, I think there was a lot of tension there that's been covered up. And it was covered up, obviously we understand why, because they were trying to get everyone together for this great push and for this huge effort. But there was a lot of tension, and that was the thing that actually surprised me in my research, and I'd like to explore it further, actually, because I don't think, for the people I've spoken to, like historians who've written about this, they weren't surprised by just the general tension between the 2 armies, you know, and they had to try and get them to work together. So this the segregation in the US Army sort of didn't create the wedge, it made sure the wedge was always there. That was the sort of thing, but there were other underlying tensions.
Thank you.
Fantastic. And do you want to follow that up at all, Jasper?
No, that's great. No, I was similarly really interested and struck by it.
Fantastic. So Karen's asked, was it Shepton Mallet prison that the men were sent to?
No, they weren't. So Shepton Mallet is where the US Army executed the prisoners it found guilty. In actual fact, they used the British executioner because he was better at his job. But no, they didn't go to Shepton Mallet. They went actually back to Somerset, and then they went home. They were shipped off to America, back to a military camp there. But Shepton Mallet's something that intrigues me, and when it's lockdown's over, I do want to go and have a look there, because I think there are a lot of stories to be told there. And they've got, I'm trying to track down their archive actually. I've spoken interestingly to a British man who won at auction the diaries of the execution, and he's gone through the diaries for me, and he didn't mention anything about the Americans other than the fact that he was employed by them. Originally they got their own executioner in, but he made such a sort of terrible job of it that he was asked to do it instead. But for me, it seems like the British were even willing to give their executioner to the Americans for crimes that we wouldn't have killed people for.
Yeah, there's definitely a story or two in that, isn't there? So Abigail's gone now, but she said, thank you for this lovely introduction to your book. I've enjoyed hearing about it immensely. Jenny, do you want to ask your question? Is Jenny still here?
Yes.
So I'll unmute and...
Hi, Jenny.
Yeah, hi, I'll read it out. So, Kate, unfortunately, I haven't had time to read your book yet, but my question is, do you touch on the subject of Lucy Bland's book, which is called Britain's Brown Babies, on the children whose fathers were Black American soldiers? I was at national school, also taught by Charles Causley in the 50s, and we were aware of this issue, and I see Colin Gregory, a fellow national school pupil, will also be aware, but it would be more truthful to say that at the time, I certainly wasn't aware of the difference of these children. It's only in hindsight and being aware of Lucy Bland's research and hearing her podcast, the BBC podcast, that I've become interested in this subject, because I knew very well 4 children whose fathers were American soldiers. 3 of them had the good fortune to be brought up within their own family, the mother's family. One of them, a boy, was fostered and came to national school, but then was re-fostered at the age of 11. But I noticed in Lucy Bland's book that in many of the families, when the father came back and realised what had happened, the children had to be sent to a children's home. The only 4 that I'm aware of, 3 rather, were brought up in Launceston in their own families. Colin, I don't know whether you want to come in on this, but... So the question really is, Kate, whether you touched on this or whether this is really Lucy Bland's book and another subject.
That for me, that is another subject, but it is utterly fascinating. When I first started making documentaries years ago, because I'm very old, there was a brilliant documentary called Brown Babies, and it was something that I've read about. It's not part of my story, but interestingly, this is another follow-up from the Charles Causley Festival. I've had 3 grandchildren of GIs fathered by men stationed in Cornwall, in Launceston actually, who tried to trace their grandfathers. They want more information about it. And for me, I think it's another book, actually. I don't know about Lucy Bland's book. I've written it down. I will read it. And I'm so delighted you have told me about that. And it's lovely to see all you former pupils together. It's really nice. And yeah, it's something I'd love to explore, because how were these guys raised? Were they treated? How were they treated? All these kind of differences, because I know that there was a society created, wasn't there, to look after these kids so they could kind of keep together and keep in contact, wasn't there?
I don't know about that. As I say, I only know about the 3 children who were brought up within the mother's family and alongside the mother's other children. When I was doing a bit of my own research, I was amazed to find that there's a website called GI Baby Looking for Biological Father, and there is a Facebook page called Find My GI Father. So people are still continuing their search, even though these fathers, would be in their 90s, 100. So they often find half sisters from the father's families when they've, second families when they've gone back to America. But a very moving topic.
And also, just to come back on that, so many of these men tried to marry the women. They were banned. They were not allowed to do that by the army. Because back in America, most of the states, they were illegal. They were called mixed marriages. They weren't allowed. But who have I spoken to? One of these girls who's been in touch, she's the granddaughter of a GI. Her whole family went to this guy's base and pleaded with the big man, with the guy in charge, and he banned it. He said, no, this has nothing to do with me. And the guy tried to come back. He wasn't allowed to come back. It is so sad. And if we can do anything to help, these people find out about their grandfathers and their experiences, because it's part of them and who they are, it would be really nice. But I'm going to buy that book and I shall read it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you.
Brilliant question, really good question, Jenny. And actually, seeing all the Charles's, or seeing a number of Charles's ex-pupils here, makes me almost think that maybe our follow-up event, maybe it's virtual to start with, and then physical. Maybe we just have a pupils and friends of Charles Causley Zoom. I think that would be lovely, because then no matter where anyone is, they can all come together. So there you go. There's maybe another idea, seeing you all here now. Karen, do you want to, because obviously yours is less of a question, but more of one of your experience. Do you want to share that with us?
Yeah, I mean, I've spoken to Kate on the phone, and I've watched the progress, and her research in the book just blew me away. I've never read anything so detailed. It is astronomical. And where I live in Bristol, there is just down the road from me is an old civilian airport called Whitchurch, which was famous in the Second World War for the flight from Bristol to Lisburn. And one of the famous actors that played Gone with the Wind was killed when the plane was shot down, Leslie Howard. So my father grew up literally 10 minutes walk from there. He remembers the GI camp, and he used to go there as a 9-year-old to scrounge chewing gum, as all the kids did, etc. Well, there, because I do the paranormal, there are reports in this sports centre that the Americans built a big hangar connected to the original 1930s one. And in the early part of the Second World War, they suffered so many casualties or dead that they flew them in overnight, held them in the hangar, then flew them out the next day. So all the locals knew about it. So I thought, fine. So I actually rang the US Army, and I ended up in Texas. And again, very polite young man, asking the questions. He said, That never happened, ma'am. They completely denied it. So it shows that even today, there's some things they will not admit. And that was nothing to do with racism or anything. It's just that I knew, probably 100 people around the area knew, but they still deny it.
Fascinating. It's a completely different world, isn't it, to the one that essentially we kind of live in. So that's kind of concluded our questions. Does anyone else have any questions or any comments that they would like to kind of make to Kate, or even if it's just that you want to share your favourite character, or even who you think should play the characters if you have actually read the book? Give Kate some ideas. Kate, I was going to say Idris Elba, but obviously he's older. But to be fair, if it takes a couple of years, we could have some phenomenal up-and-coming actors and actresses by that point. So it could be somebody completely undiscovered right now.
Yeah, I know. Cross fingers, and I will tell you. And yeah, it is a story that needs to be told, and I've always felt that. And Jasper, who's a very old friend, he's been bored. You must be bored rigid by this story, because we've spent many nights in our talking about it, haven't we? And just I said, there's this amazing story, and I just want to know. We all want to know what happens. I think people who know Launceston have known this story and wanted to know what really happened, because it's intriguing, but it's so relevant still. And I love passionately history. I love it because it is relevant. You can find those lessons and that relevance to our lives today, and it's so important that we keep doing it.
Yeah, absolutely. So Pauline, just so you know, because we're recording this, it does mean that Jonathan, who's been caught up in the Netherlands, bless him, packing shoeboxes for Operation Christmas Child. I think we can all forgive him then, can't we, for missing this, for doing something so worthy. He can have a listen later on, because it's recorded, and we'll pop it up on our YouTube channel as well. And also just a little bit more on the YouTube channel. So there is the event that we had in the summer with Kate, but there's also an interview with Kate and her father that we did. I think it was probably about 6 weeks ago now, Kate, if I remember rightly. Time flies. So we've got stuff going up there all the time. So if you're not subscribed to our YouTube channel, but you fancy kind of just keeping up with video, we're there. We've got a newsletter as well, so we send out regular updates on our newsletter. So everything like that can be found from our website. So if you if you do need any more information, just let me know. But it'd be great, obviously, to keep in contact with everybody, and especially because obviously I'll start putting some shout outs to start formulating this plan of bringing all the those that knew Charles together on a Zoom. I think that would be such a magical thing. So yeah. Okay, fantastic. Well, if anyone's got any, I'm just reading the comments. There's Kate's just mouthing sorry. So Jasper's nominated Nick for the prosecutor, and Nick's nominated Jasper for Churchill. This sounds like some sibling kind of, even though it's not a sibling, it sounds certainly that way. So some sibling jest or family kind of jest. So fantastic. Well, I don't think there's anything left to say other than thank you so much, everybody, for joining us. It's been an absolute pleasure to see some familiar faces that I saw during the festival. Obviously, Kate, Kate's father. Now I've met your brother. I don't know if there's any other family members left to meet, Kate. Oh, 2 more.
Oh, 3 more. Mum as well, and Mum, John, and Vicky.
Brilliant.
Before we go, can you hear me at all?
We can, Colin, yes.
Oh, you could, yeah, sorry. It's just I put a question on, but for some reason it didn't go on the list. It stayed at the bottom, so it didn't matter. It's just sort of going on from what Jenny was talking about, the children of those GIs who were around, and just really to say, it was one of at that age, we didn't take any notice of it. It's one of those things where we noticed it, but we didn't think it was strange, because we came into contact with those coloured children when we were all about 5, and so it wasn't an age when we questioned anything. But And then, of course, as well as that, there were a lot of white children who had GI fathers. And in Launceston, I don't know of anyone who's, I don't know that they've tried to, but I don't know of any that contacted their birth fathers, as you might say. I do know of a girl at Bude who sort of wondered all along why the father she had was so distant to her, and she found after his death that she was actually the daughter of one of the US Rangers who were training at Bude for the assault at De Hock and at Cherbourg. And she got in touch with the family. He died not that long before, but she was sort of welcomed to them out there. But I think from the point of view of GIs who, first of all, obviously some died, because they were right in the battle, in the worst parts of the battle. And then others, really probably the coloured ones, because of their lack of money, they weren't sort of registered where anybody could find them.
Yeah.
But so therefore, obviously, that's been lost. It's just strange enough, just on one thing about the general black soldiers. Only last week I saw a program on was it late yesterday of a black unit, a regiment really, that fought. They were all black apart from one, the senior officer, who actually was very close to them. Yeah. But when they got captured by the Nazis, they underwent terrible sort of torture and revolting deaths. But so they were treated very badly. But overall, as you say, most of those were kept into menial jobs, and this particular tank unit sort of won awards for bravery, but not many of them survived. Anyway, yeah, thanks very much. It's all been very interesting. I couldn't get my message wasn't about that, but I just thought I'd join in. From a Launceston point of view. It's a sort of fascinating part of the town's history.
Absolutely.
I mean, I live in Truro now, and there were a lot of black soldiers around, but you don't see the number of people in the same sort of percentage as one did at Launceston at the time. And just the only thing, because I'd say I've been out to reunions in France, and the big one, the 50 years in 1994, when the soldiers who went from, the Americans who went from Cornwall had a reunion, but there wasn't a single black soldier amongst them. So I think probably because of their financial position, they were never in a sort of, they never had the money to come back again. And I've been over to Arnhem, and there were thousands of veterans there, including the American parachutists who were called the Screaming Eagles, but they were all white, because I think the black sort of GIs who did get back never had the money to come back, or also were probably not welcome in the sort of veteran organizations in the States.
In which case they wouldn't have found out about things like reunions and all the goings on, would they? No. And then also, if you have been ostracized for that length of time, even if you did find out about it, it wouldn't feel like you wanted to kind of, rock up at that point. So
no. In the 1994 one of the things, the pictures, they did get together with and have quite a lot of music, and sort of, obviously there were some really good musicians who were amongst the troops, but also obviously the star turn in Cornwall was Joe Louis, the boxer, who came over really on a promotional things. So he went to Padstow, Bodmin, and various places. But when I was doing my pieces for the 1994 sort of anniversaries, you might say, one chap from Chasewater told me a story where there was a knock on the door, and he went to the door and opened the door, and his father said, "Who is it?" And he said, "It's Joe Louis." He said, "Don't be stupid. Who is it?" He said, "It's Joe Louis." And he came in, there's this big world champion boxer came through the door in Chasewater.
Brilliant, brilliant stories. Well, thank you ever so much, everybody, for attending, and obviously, you know, the kind of support that you've shown Kate, the support that you've shown the Causley Trust as well. Just really pleased to kind of see a turnout digitally. And although we can't be all together, the nice thing is that Kate can be where she is, and we can all be where we are in the comfort of our own homes, and we can still experience it. So obviously watch this space for kind of any follow-up events, and I guess, you know, normally at this point we'd all say, you know, and travel safely home, but I think we all should be at home, unless you're at work, which is fine, but in theory we should all be home. So thank you ever so much. I will wait, and I'll be the last one to leave. So if you want to let yourselves out, feel free. If you want to turn your cameras on, if you want to unmute and give Kate a clap, that would be fantastic too.
Thank you.
So, well done, Kate.
Thank you so much, Ellie. You're
welcome.
Okay, see you. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
Bye.
Have a good evening.
Thank you. Thanks, darling.
You're welcome.